In 1969, the quiet town of Brantford is about to become the starting point of one of the strangest and most dangerous adventures imaginable. Because beneath the ordinary streets and houses of this small community lies a mysterious wooden board game called Jumanji, a game that looks like an old fashioned children's toy but is actually something far more powerful. And when young Alan Parrish discovers it, he has no idea that opening the box will completely change his life. The 1995 film Jumanji, directed by Joe Johnston and starring Robin Williams, Kirsten Dunst, Bradley Pierce, Bonnie Hunt, Jonathan Hyde, David Allen Greer, and B.B. Newworth, is a fantasy adventure built around the idea that a board game can literally bring its dangers into the real world. The movie is based on Chris Van Allsburg's children's book and turns its simple concept into a much larger story involving supernatural forces, jungle animals, giant insects, stampeding creatures, and a mysterious game that cannot be stopped until somebody finishes it. The story begins in 1969 with Alan Parrish, a young boy who lives in a valley home with his parents, Sam and Carol Parrish. Alan's father owns a successful shoe factory, and from the outside, Alan appears to have everything a young boy could want. But Alan does not feel comfortable with the expectations placed on him. His father is strong, successful, and demanding, and Alan feels that he is constantly being compared to the person his father wants him to become. Alan is also bullied by other boys in town, especially Billy Jessup, who makes Alan's life miserable and humiliates him whenever he gets the chance. Alan does have a friend in Sarah Whittle, a young girl who understands him better than most people do. But even Sarah cannot protect him from everything happening around him. One day, after Alan has been bullied and embarrassed, he discovers something unusual. While near a construction area, he hears the mysterious sound of drums beating in the distance. The sound seems impossible to explain, but it draws Alan toward a buried box. Inside the box is an old board game with the strange name Jumanji. The game looks ancient, almost as if it has been waiting for someone to find it. Alan takes the game home, not realizing that he has just brought something supernatural into his family's house. The board is beautifully designed with jungle imagery and strange pieces that appear to have a life of their own. Alan is curious, and curiosity is exactly what the game seems to need. He begins examining it and eventually starts playing. Sarah is there with him, and although neither of them understands the rules completely, they continue. The game appears harmless at first. It is only a board, dice, and pieces. But then the supernatural nature of Jumanji begins to reveal itself. The game produces messages that seem to predict what will happen next. It becomes clear that this is not an ordinary board game where players simply move pieces around a track. Every roll can release something into the real world. The players cannot simply decide to stop whenever they become frightened. Once the game begins, the only way to return everything to normal is to finish it. This rule becomes one of the most important elements of the entire movie. Alan does not understand the danger until it is too late. During the game, something happens that changes his life forever. Alan is pulled into the world of Jumanji, disappearing from the real world and becoming trapped inside the game's mysterious jungle. Sarah witnesses what happens and is terrified. She believes Alan has disappeared, but she has no idea where he has gone or how to bring him back. The game remains behind, waiting. Alan's parents search for him. The town begins to develop rumors, and eventually people assume that something terrible happened to the boy. But Alan is not dead. He is trapped inside Jumanji, surviving in a wild and dangerous world filled with creatures and dangers that seem to exist outside the normal laws of nature. For Alan, time becomes completely different. While the real world continues moving forward, Alan remains trapped inside the game. He has no way to escape and no way to contact the people outside. The experience transforms him from the young boy we met at the beginning into someone hardened by years of survival. He must learn to live in the jungle, avoiding animals, surviving dangerous situations, and waiting for the possibility that someone might eventually play the game again. Meanwhile, the world outside continues without him. His family is devastated. His disappearance becomes one of the great mysteries of Brantford. His father especially struggles with the loss of his son. Alan's disappearance affects the parish family deeply, and the emotional consequences continue for decades. The story then jumps forward to 1995, 26 years after Alan vanished. The parish mansion has become an old and mysterious house, and a new family is moving into the property. Judy and Peter Shepherd arrive with their aunt Nora after a difficult period in their lives. The children are dealing with the loss of their parents, and their new home feels strange and unfamiliar. Nora is trying to create a stable environment for them, but the mansion itself carries a history that they do not understand. Judy is imaginative, curious, and energetic, while Peter is quieter and more cautious. Because the house is large and filled with old rooms, the children naturally begin exploring. They discover unusual objects, hidden spaces, and eventually the old board game that has been waiting for them. Jumanji has spent decades untouched, but it has not lost its power. The game seems to call to the children in the same way it once called to Alan. They find it in the attic and become curious about what it is. At first, they do not understand why the game seems so strange. They open it and begin examining the pieces. Like Alan before them, they are drawn into the mystery. They do not realize that by rolling the dice, they are continuing a game that began decades earlier. The first rolls immediately demonstrate that something supernatural is happening. Strange creatures begin appearing in and around the house, including giant mosquitoes and monkeys. Suddenly, the children's home is no longer a safe place. The animals are not simply ordinary creatures that wandered inside. They are manifestations of the game itself. Every role produces a new challenge, and the children quickly understand that they need to find a way to stop the game. But stopping is not an option. The rules indicate that the game must be completed. This creates a terrifying situation for Judy and Peter because they are only children, yet they are now responsible for controlling something they barely understand. The game itself appears to know what is happening. It gives clues through mysterious messages, warning the players about what is coming. Each message is like a riddle, forcing the players to figure out what danger will appear next. The children realize that if they continue playing, the situation could become even worse. But if they stop, the dangers they have already released will remain. Their only hope is to finish. During the game, Peter rolls the dice and something incredible happens. Alan Parrish is released from the world of Jumanji and suddenly appears in the real world as an adult man. The boy who disappeared in 1969 is now a grown man, played by Robin Williams. Alan is confused because he has spent what feels like an eternity inside the jungle, while the real world has changed completely. He looks around and realizes that he is back in his childhood home, but the home is no longer the place he remembers. The technology, the surroundings, and the people are different. He eventually learns that 26 years have passed. For Alan, it is an overwhelming realization. He has missed his entire adolescence. He never experienced the normal process of growing up. He was suddenly transported from childhood into adulthood through years of survival inside a supernatural world. When he sees Judy and Peter, he initially struggles to understand who they are or why they are playing the game. But he quickly realizes that they may be his only chance to end the nightmare. Alan explains that Jumanji cannot simply be abandoned. The game has to be completed, and the only way to stop the supernatural chaos is to continue playing until the final move. This means that Judy and Peter have accidentally become responsible for finishing the game Alan started decades earlier. But there is another problem. Alan needs Sarah Whittle. Sarah was the girl who was with him when he disappeared in 1969, and she is the only other person who knows what happened. Alan remembers her as a frightened young girl, but when he finally finds her decades later, she is an adult woman who has spent much of her life carrying the trauma of Alan's disappearance. Sarah has tried to move on, but the memory has never completely left her. When Alan returns, Sarah is forced to confront the past she tried to bury. At first, she struggles to believe that the man standing before her is actually Alan. From her perspective, he disappeared as a boy. Now he is an adult, carrying memories of a world that sounds impossible. The reunion is emotional because Sarah has spent 26 years believing that Alan was gone. Seeing him alive forces her to question everything she thought she knew. Alan also has complicated feelings because he remembers Sarah as the girl who was there when he disappeared. Now she is an adult, and both of them have lost decades of their lives to the consequences of the game. But they cannot spend too much time dealing with the emotional shock because Jumanji continues generating dangers. The game is still active, and the longer they wait, the more chaotic Brantford becomes. Alan, Judy, Peter, and Sarah realize that they have to work together. The four players represent different generations and different experiences. Alan has knowledge of the game because he survived inside it. Sarah understands what happened during the original game. Judy is intelligent and determined, while Peter is younger but increasingly brave. Their combined abilities become necessary because no single person can handle Jumanji alone. The first major threats demonstrate just how dangerous the game can be. Animals begin appearing throughout the town. The chaos spreads beyond the parish mansion, and ordinary people become involved. The game has effectively turned Brantford into a jungle. What was once a quiet town is suddenly filled with creatures that should never exist there. The characters have to move quickly while trying to keep the situation from becoming completely uncontrollable. The visual concept of the movie is one of its defining features. Instead of simply showing the players imagining jungle dangers, the film brings those dangers physically into their world. The house becomes a jungle environment. Streets become dangerous. Vehicles are threatened. Ordinary spaces are transformed into places of survival. This approach gives the movie a sense of constant unpredictability because the audience never knows what the next role will unleash. The supernatural board game functions almost like an enemy that cannot be reasoned with. It follows its own rules. The players cannot negotiate with it. They can only play. That makes every dice roll terrifying. The movie's concept also creates a clever connection between childhood games and real world consequences. Children normally play board games because they are safe ways to experience competition and adventure. Jumanji takes that idea and turns it upside down. Here, losing is not simply disappointing. Losing can mean being attacked by wild animals, trapped by plants, chased by insects, or overwhelmed by supernatural chaos. The game therefore becomes a metaphor for consequences. Every decision matters. Every role creates something new. And once you begin, you have to finish what you started. Alan understands this better than anyone because he has already spent 26 years paying the price for one game. His experience inside Jumanji has also left him with a deep fear of the game's dangers. Although he is physically stronger and more experienced than the children, he knows that the jungle can produce almost anything. His survival instincts make him valuable, but they also reveal how deeply traumatized he has become. Alan has essentially been living in survival mode for decades. Returning to the real world does not immediately make him feel safe. In many ways, he is still trapped mentally in the jungle. Sarah sees this and realizes that the Alan she remembers is still somewhere inside the adult man standing before her. Their relationship becomes an important emotional part of the story because both characters are forced to confront the consequences of the night Alan disappeared. Sarah has carried guilt, fear, and uncertainty for years. Alan has carried isolation and survival trauma. Reuniting them allows both characters to begin healing. Judy and Peter also become emotionally important to Alan because they remind him of the childhood he lost. They are close to the age he was when he disappeared, and watching them experience the game reminds him of himself. He becomes protective of them. At first, he may see them as children who accidentally caused the problem, but gradually they become partners in the mission. Judy's intelligence and determination impress him, while Peter's courage develops as the danger increases. The children's relationship with Alan also gives him a second chance at the childhood and family connection he lost. He cannot go back and experience his teenage years, but he can help these children survive something similar. Meanwhile, the game continues producing new dangers. Giant insects become a major threat, with mosquitoes large enough to create panic and danger. Monkeys cause chaos inside the house, damaging property and creating confusion. The animals are not simply there for visual spectacle. Each one represents another obstacle the players must overcome. The film uses these creatures to keep the pace moving and to create a sense that the rules of reality have been completely broken. At one point, the appearance of a lion makes the danger even more serious. Alan recognizes that the animals from Jumanji are not normal, and he understands how quickly they can become deadly. The characters have to work together to survive. Their escape from one threat often leads directly into another. This constant chain of dangers is what makes Jumanji feel like an unstoppable force. Every time the players think they have a moment to breathe, the game produces another challenge. The mysterious messages on the board continue predicting what will happen next, but they are often written like riddles. The players must interpret them quickly. A single mistake can put them directly into the path of danger. Alan becomes the team's guide because he understands the basic logic of the game. He knows that every role matters and that the final goal is to reach the end. But even Alan cannot predict every detail. Jumanji remains mysterious even to the person who spent decades inside it. The game seems almost alive, reacting to the players and creating challenges designed specifically to test them. The story also introduces Van Pelt, a dangerous big game hunter connected to Alan's past and played by Jonathan Hyde, who also plays Alan's father, Sam Parrish. Van Pelt is not simply another animal or obstacle. He is a human-like antagonist who understands hunting and sees Alan as his prey. His presence adds a different kind of danger to the story. Animals can be unpredictable, but Van Pelt is intelligent, strategic, and personally focused on Alan. His appearance makes Alan confront the fears he developed inside Jumanji. Van Pelt becomes a physical representation of the jungle's hostility, and his pursuit forces Alan to use everything he learned during his years of survival. The relationship between Van Pelt and Alan is especially interesting because Jonathan Hyde plays both Van Pelt and Sam Parrish, Alan's father. This creates a symbolic connection between the two figures. Alan spent much of his childhood feeling pressured by his father, and inside Jumanji, he is hunted by a figure who resembles him. The movie uses this connection to explore Alan's relationship with fear and authority. Alan has spent years believing that he failed his father, but later learns that his father never stopped looking for him. In fact, Alan discovers that Sam devoted much of his life and resources to finding his missing son. This revelation changes Alan's understanding of his childhood. He realizes that his father loved him deeply, even though their relationship had been difficult. The discovery becomes another emotional step in Alan's journey. The factory that once represented his father's success is now closed, and Brantford itself has suffered because of Alan's disappearance and the Parrish family's decline. Alan sees the consequences of the past everywhere. The town is not the place he remembers, and the people he knew have moved on or died. He visits his parents' graves and is forced to confront the reality that while he was trapped inside Jumanji, his parents lived and died without ever seeing him again. This is one of the most painful moments of the story because Alan realizes how much he lost. Yet, it also gives him motivation to finish the game. He cannot recover the lost years, but he can finally stop Jumanji from controlling his life. Sarah, Judy, and Peter remain beside him, and together they return to the mansion. The game is still waiting. The four players understand that the only way to restore normality is to finish what Alan and Sarah began in 1969. They take their positions and prepare for the next role. The atmosphere inside the house becomes increasingly tense. The board sits in front of them like an ordinary object, but everyone knows it contains enough power to destroy the town. Alan warns them that the game must be completed. There is no turning back. They roll the dice and another challenge begins. As the game continues, the mansion becomes increasingly transformed. Jungle plants grow rapidly, animals move through rooms, and the architecture itself begins feeling less like a home and more like a battlefield. The characters must constantly move and adapt. Judy and Peter become braver, while Sarah gradually overcomes the fear that has followed her for decades. Alan becomes more determined because he now understands that finishing the game will not only save the town but also finally free him from the nightmare that began when he was a child. The group starts functioning as a true team. Their personalities are different, but their goal is the same. They must survive long enough to complete the game. The supernatural nature of Jumanji means that there is no easy solution. They cannot destroy the board. They cannot simply throw it away. They cannot walk away. The game has to be finished. That rule creates the central tension of the movie and forces the characters to continue even when they are exhausted. Each role becomes another test of courage. As part 1 reaches its conclusion, the players have already learned the most important lesson. Jumanji is not a game they control. It is a game that controls them. Alan has returned after 26 years, Sarah has been forced to confront the trauma of Alan's disappearance, and Judy and Peter have become trapped in a supernatural adventure they never expected. The town is beginning to suffer from the consequences, and the dangers are becoming increasingly difficult to contain. Yet there is still hope. If the four players can remain together, understand the clues, and reach the end of the board, they may be able to restore everything to the way it was. But the game is only beginning to reveal its full power. More creatures are coming. Van Pelt is hunting Alan, and every new roll threatens to unleash something even more dangerous. Alan knows that surviving Jumanji once was difficult enough. Now he must survive it again while protecting three people who have become his allies. The difference is that this time he is not alone. Judy, Peter, and Sarah stand beside him, and together they prepare to continue playing the most dangerous board game in the world. The next roll will bring another challenge, and the group will soon discover that escaping Jumanji will require more than luck. It will require courage, trust, and the willingness to finish the game no matter how terrifying the journey becomes. The game has now taken control of the entire situation, and Alan Parrish, Sarah Whittle, Judy Shepard, and Peter Shepard understand that there is only one possible way to return everything to normal. They must finish the game that Alan and Sarah started 26 years earlier. But what makes their situation terrifying is that every turn of Jumanji brings another supernatural threat into the real world, and there is no way of knowing exactly how dangerous the next roll will be. So while Alan understands the rules better than anyone else because he spent decades trapped inside the game, even he cannot predict everything Jumanji is capable of doing. And this uncertainty becomes the central source of tension as the four players continue their desperate attempt to reach the end of the board. Alan has already experienced the jungle from inside the game, and his memories of that place make him extremely cautious because he knows that Jumanji does not simply create harmless obstacles for entertainment. It creates situations designed to test the players until they either succeed or are overwhelmed. For Judy and Peter, this is difficult to understand because they have grown up in a world where games are supposed to remain inside the box. But Jumanji has completely destroyed that boundary, turning their home and their town into an extension of the game itself. Sarah, meanwhile, is still struggling emotionally with Ellen's return. For 26 years, she believed that Ellen disappeared because of something terrible that happened after they began playing, and she has spent much of her adult life carrying the memory of that night. Seeing him alive should be a miracle, but it also forces her to confront the fear and guilt that she buried for decades. Ellen tries to reassure her, explaining that he never blamed her for what happened, but the emotional damage is still there. Sarah remembers being a frightened teenager who ran away from the house after seeing Ellen disappear, and she has always believed that she somehow failed him. Now she has a chance to correct that mistake, and finishing the game becomes more than a mission to save Brantford. It becomes a way for Sarah to finally release the guilt she has carried for most of her life. Judy and Peter also begin to understand that Alan is not simply an adult who suddenly appeared in their house. He is a person who lost his entire childhood. Alan was only a boy when he entered Jumanji, and when he returned, everyone he knew had grown old or disappeared. His parents are gone, his childhood home has changed, and the world he remembers has moved forward without him. For Alan, returning to 1995 is almost like waking up in another universe. He remembers a time before computers, modern technology, and the social changes that occurred over 26 years. He has to learn how the world works again while simultaneously dealing with the supernatural game that trapped him in the first place. Yet, despite his confusion, Alan's survival instincts make him the natural leader of the group. He knows that fear cannot be allowed to control them. Every time someone panics, the situation becomes more dangerous. He tells Judy and Peter that they must pay attention to the clues printed on the board and understand that every message is a warning about what is coming next. The strange poems and riddles become increasingly important because they give the players a few seconds of preparation before the next disaster begins. But the clues are never simple. They force the players to think quickly, and sometimes they only understand the meaning after the danger has already appeared. This creates a constant feeling that the characters are always one step behind the game. One of the most frightening aspects of Jumanji is that its dangers do not stay in one place. The animals and supernatural events spread through Brantford, creating chaos among people who have no idea what is happening. Giant creatures appear in streets where ordinary people are driving cars and walking to work. Police officers are confused because the events seem impossible to explain. The town gradually becomes a place of panic as animals that belong in distant jungles suddenly appear in a quiet American community. The movie uses this contrast to create both comedy and suspense. Seeing wild animals running through familiar streets is visually absurd, but it is also dangerous because the characters know that these creatures are not behaving according to normal rules. The monkeys, for example, create complete chaos inside the parish mansion, destroying furniture, stealing objects, and moving through the house as if they own it. They are funny in some moments, but their presence also demonstrates that the boundary between the game and reality has completely disappeared. Then come larger and more dangerous creatures. Giant mosquitoes become a serious threat, and the players are forced to protect themselves from insects that are far larger than anything they have ever encountered. The characters cannot simply wait for the creatures to disappear because the game will continue producing new dangers until they finish. Every roll therefore becomes a decision between moving forward and facing another disaster. The players know that the only real solution is to keep going. The board itself almost seems alive, waiting patiently for them to make the next move. Alan understands this better than anyone. He knows that stopping is impossible because he already spent years trapped inside Jumanji. The game is not interested in whether the players are tired, frightened, or ready. It simply continues. That is why Alan becomes increasingly determined to complete it. He has already lost 26 years and he refuses to lose another moment. He also understands that Judy and Peter deserve to return to a normal life. They never asked for any of this. They found the game by accident, just as he did, and now they are paying the price for touching something they did not understand. Alan feels responsible for protecting them because their situation reminds him of his own childhood. He was once a boy who opened the game without understanding the consequences, and now he is watching another generation of children experience the same danger. This gives Alan a deeper emotional connection to Judy and Peter. He is not simply trying to survive, he is trying to make sure they do not lose their childhood the way he did. Peter, in particular, begins changing as the adventure continues. At first, he is nervous and uncertain, but the danger forces him to become more courageous. He sees Alan facing creatures that would terrify almost anyone, and gradually learns that courage means acting despite fear. Judy also becomes an important part of the group because she is intelligent and quick to understand the game's clues. Her curiosity, which initially helped her discover Jumanji, now becomes useful because she can analyze information quickly. Sarah, meanwhile, starts to regain the confidence she lost decades earlier. Being with Alan forces her to remember the person she once was before fear took control of her life. She begins realizing that she is not the helpless teenager who ran away in 1969. She is now an adult, capable of making decisions and protecting others. This emotional growth becomes especially important when Van Pelt enters the story. Van Pelt is unlike the animals released by Jumanji because he is intelligent, strategic, and specifically focused on Alan. He is a hunter and he sees Alan as his ultimate prey. The presence of Van Pelt immediately changes the atmosphere. Alan has spent years surviving in the jungle, but Van Pelt represents the most personal part of that nightmare. He knows Alan's weaknesses and understands how to track him. Alan recognizes that Van Pelt is not simply another challenge that can be avoided by hiding. He is an enemy who will continue hunting until one of them is defeated. The fact that Jonathan Hyde plays both Van Pelt and Alan's father adds an interesting psychological layer to the story. Alan spent his childhood struggling with his father's expectations, believing that he could never become the person his father wanted him to be. Van Pelt, with his commanding presence and aggressive personality, resembles the kind of authority figure Alan feared as a child. In this sense, confronting Van Pelt becomes partly a confrontation with Alan's own childhood fears. Alan has spent years believing that he was weak, disappointing, and incapable of meeting his father's expectations. But the person who survived Jumanji for 26 years is not weak. He is resilient. He has learned how to survive conditions that would destroy most people. His experience inside the game has made him stronger, even though it has also left emotional scars. When Van Pelt begins hunting him in the real world, Alan is forced to use that strength. The group tries to stay together because splitting up would make them easier targets. But Jumanji repeatedly creates situations that separate them or make communication difficult. The house itself becomes almost impossible to control. Plants grow rapidly through rooms, animals move through hallways, and the environment becomes increasingly wild. The mansion that once represented Alan's childhood is now becoming a physical representation of Jumanji. Alan looks around and sees the home he remembers disappearing beneath the jungle. This is symbolic because his childhood itself has already been lost. The game is literally taking over the place where his childhood memories were created. Yet the group continues. Their determination becomes stronger with every challenge. They begin to understand that they cannot defeat Jumanji by fighting each individual creature. The creatures are only symptoms of the game. The real solution is reaching the end of the board. That means every obstacle must be survived rather than permanently defeated. The movie's pacing during this section depends heavily on that structure. A new clue appears, the characters interpret it, a new threat emerges, the group survives, and then they return to the board for another turn. This creates a rhythm that feels almost like the chapters of an adventure story. Each turn is a new chapter, and the stakes become progressively higher. The audience knows that the game must eventually reach a final stage, but the characters do not know how many dangers remain. This uncertainty keeps the tension alive. One of the major themes developing beneath the action is the idea of consequences. Alan's decision to play the game in 1969 created consequences that lasted 26 years. Judy and Peter's decision to open the box in 1995 creates another chain of consequences. The movie suggests that actions cannot always be undone simply by wishing they had never happened. Once the game begins, the players must take responsibility and finish it. This idea also connects to Alan's relationship with his father. Alan had believed for years that his father was ashamed of him, but after returning, he learns that the truth was very different. Sam Parrish never stopped loving his son. He searched for Alan and suffered deeply because he could not find him. The discovery is painful because Alan realizes that his father died without ever knowing that his son was alive. Yet it also gives Alan peace. He no longer has to carry the belief that he disappointed his father. He can finally understand that the relationship was more complicated than he remembered. This revelation helps Alan become emotionally stronger for the final stages of the game. He no longer needs to prove himself to his father. He only needs to survive for himself and the people beside him. Sarah also experiences an emotional transformation through her reunion with Alan. For years, she believed that she had abandoned him, but Alan tells her the truth. She was a frightened child caught in an impossible situation. She could not have known how to deal with Jumanji. Her fear was understandable. Hearing this allows Sarah to forgive herself. She begins to see that returning to the game is not a punishment. It is an opportunity to finally end the nightmare. Her courage grows as the dangers increase, and she becomes an equal member of the team rather than someone Alan needs to protect. The relationship between Alan and Sarah also carries the weight of their shared history. They remember the night they played together as children, and although the memory is painful, it also connects them. Their friendship becomes a bridge between the past and present. They are no longer the children who accidentally started the game. They are adults who have returned to finish it. Judy and Peter provide the connection to the present generation, and the four characters, therefore, represent two different moments in time connected by the same game. Alan and Sarah are finishing what they started, while Judy and Peter are helping them do it. This structure gives the story a sense of destiny without requiring the characters to be related. The game brings people together across decades. As the turns continue, the dangers become more spectacular. Massive creatures, aggressive plants, swarms of insects, and destructive animals make the mansion almost impossible to recognize. The special effects are a major part of the film's appeal because the audience is asked to believe that these creatures are physically present in the real world. The movie was produced at a time when digital visual effects were developing rapidly, and it combined practical effects, animatronics, miniatures, and computer-generated imagery to create its supernatural animals. This combination helped give Jumanji's creatures a physical presence. The animals are not simply images floating on the screen. They interact with the characters and environments, making the danger feel immediate. The sound design also contributes to the experience. The mysterious drums of Jumanji become a recurring audio symbol throughout the film. Whenever the drums are heard, the audience knows that something is about to happen. The sound creates anticipation before the visual threat appears. The jungle noises, animal sounds, screams, and destruction add to the feeling that the natural world has invaded civilization. The music by James Horner also plays an important role, giving the movie a mixture of adventure, mystery, danger, and emotion. The score helps shift the tone between comedy and suspense without making the movie feel like two completely different stories. Robin Williams' performance as Alan is central to the movie because he has to balance several different emotional states. Alan can be funny, confused, frightened, angry, protective, and deeply emotional. Williams brings a physical energy to the character that makes his transformation from traumatized survivor to determined protector believable. His scenes with Judy and Peter also reveal a softer side of Alan. He sees their childhood innocence and recognizes what he lost. Instead of becoming bitter, he uses his experience to protect them. Kirsten Dunst and Bradley Pierce also help make Judy and Peter feel like real children rather than simply characters who exist to move the plot forward. Their reactions to the impossible events are often funny because they respond like children would, but they also show genuine fear and courage. Bonnie Hunt's Sarah brings emotional depth to the story because her character carries 26 years of unresolved trauma. She has to rediscover her connection with Alan while facing the game she has spent most of her life trying to forget. Together, the cast creates a balance between adventure and emotional storytelling. As the game approaches its later stages, the group becomes more exhausted. They have been running, fighting, hiding, and solving clues for what feels like an endless period. But the closer they get to the final spaces on the board, the more dangerous the challenges become. Jumanji appears to resist being completed. The game has held Alan for 26 years and now it seems determined to test everyone who tries to finish it. Van Pelt's pursuit adds another layer of urgency because the players cannot simply focus on the board. They must also avoid being captured. Alan knows that if Van Pelt catches him, the situation could become much worse. Van Pelt is not interested in helping them finish the game. He wants to hunt Alan, and that makes him one of the most personal threats in the story. Alan's fear of Van Pelt also demonstrates how much the jungle affected him psychologically. Even after returning to civilization, part of Alan still expects the hunter to appear. When Van Pelt finally confronts him, Alan must overcome the fear that has followed him since childhood. The confrontation becomes a test of whether Alan is still the frightened boy who ran into the game or the adult survivor who has returned to finish it. He realizes that he cannot allow fear to control him anymore. He has spent enough of his life running. Now he must face the threat directly. The other characters support him, showing how the group has evolved from four people connected only by circumstances into a genuine team. They trust one another. They understand that each person's role matters. Judy watches the clues, Peter finds courage, Sarah confronts her past, and Alan uses his knowledge of Jumanji. Together, they become stronger than they would be individually. This is one of the movie's most important ideas. Survival is not simply about individual strength, it is about cooperation. The game may create individual challenges, but the players can overcome them by supporting one another. As Part 2 moves toward its conclusion, the group has survived enough to understand the basic nature of Jumanji. It is a game that turns imagination into reality, and every role creates a consequence. The only way to restore normal life is to reach the end. Alan's return has also changed the emotional meaning of the game. What began as a childhood mistake has become a chance for him to reclaim the life he lost. Sarah has a chance to release her guilt. Judy and Peter have a chance to save their home and their town. And all four characters now have a reason to continue even when the dangers become overwhelming. But the game still has many surprises left. The creatures are becoming larger, the environment is becoming more chaotic, and Van Pelt remains determined to capture Alan. The board is still sitting in front of them, waiting for another role. The players know that every move brings them closer to freedom, but it may also bring them face to face with something worse than anything they have encountered so far. Alan looks at the game and understands that the only option is to keep going. After 26 years of waiting, he finally has the opportunity to finish what he started. Sarah stands beside him, no longer the frightened girl from 1969, but an adult ready to face the past. Judy and Peter prepare themselves for another turn, knowing that their courage will be tested again. Outside, Brantford continues to descend into chaos as the supernatural effects of Jumanji spread farther through the town. The ordinary world is disappearing beneath the game's influence, and the players realize that they cannot afford to fail. The next stage will push them closer to the final confrontation, where Alan will have to face the deepest fears created by his years inside Jumanji, and where the four players will finally discover whether they can complete the game and restore everything to normal. For now, however, the board remains open, the drums continue to echo, and the jungle is coming closer. The adventure has already transformed the lives of everyone involved, but the most dangerous turns are still ahead, and the final victory will require them to survive one last series of challenges before Jumanji finally releases them. The situation in Brantford has now become almost impossible to control because Jumanji is no longer simply affecting the parish house. Its supernatural power is spreading into the streets, bringing the dangers of the jungle directly into the ordinary world. And Alan, Sarah, Judy, and Peter know that every second they spend away from the board gives the game more time to create chaos. But at the same time, they cannot simply rush through the remaining turns because every roll can unleash something far more dangerous than the last challenge. And Alan understands this better than anyone because he remembers what Jumanji was capable of when he was trapped inside it as a child. 26 years earlier, Alan had entered the game because he was curious. But now he understands that curiosity without caution can have enormous consequences. He looks at Judy and Peter and sees himself and Sarah as children, two young people who never expected that an innocent looking board game could change their entire lives. He knows that the children are frightened, but he also knows that fear cannot be allowed to stop them. If they stop playing, the creatures already released will remain in the real world, and if they abandon the game completely, there may be no way to restore Brantford. So the four players return to the board and prepare for another turn. The atmosphere inside the mansion has changed completely. What was once a beautiful and expensive home has become a battlefield filled with jungle plants, broken furniture, wild animals, and evidence of the supernatural forces that have been released from Jumanji. The walls and floors are covered with signs of destruction, and the characters have barely enough time to recover before the next challenge begins. The mysterious drums echo again, creating an atmosphere of anticipation. Alan knows that the sound means another event is coming, and everyone looks toward the board. The next message appears, giving them another cryptic warning. The clues are written like short poems, and while they might look playful to an ordinary person, Alan knows that every line can describe something dangerous. Judy reads the message carefully and tries to determine what it means, while Peter stays close to Alan. Sarah watches the board with a mixture of fear and determination. She has spent 26 years trying to forget this game, but now she has chosen to face it. This is important because Sarah's greatest enemy is not only Jumanji itself, but the memories connected to it. Every roll brings back another piece of the night when Alan disappeared. She remembers how frightened she was, how she ran from the house, and how she spent years believing that Alan was gone forever. But now, Alan is standing in front of her, and she realizes that the past cannot be changed. The only thing they can control is what they do now. Sarah begins to understand that finishing the game is also a form of healing. If they can reach the end, the nightmare that began in 1969 can finally be closed. Alan feels something similar. He has spent decades trapped in a world where survival was everything. The jungle taught him to react quickly, hide from danger, search for food, and protect himself, but it never taught him how to live normally. Returning to Brantford has shown him how much he lost. He sees people living ordinary lives and realizes that he never had the chance to experience adulthood naturally. He missed school, friendships, relationships, and countless ordinary moments that other people take for granted. Yet, instead of allowing himself to become bitter, Alan decides to use the time he has now to finish the game and protect the people around him. Judy and Peter gradually become more important to him because they give him something he has not had for decades, a connection to childhood. He is able to guide them because he understands their fear, but they also help Alan rediscover the part of himself that was lost inside Jumanji. Judy, in particular, refuses to surrender. She is intelligent, observant, and willing to take risks when necessary. Peter is younger and sometimes frightened, but his courage develops as the story continues. He begins to understand that bravery does not mean being fearless, it means protecting the people you care about even when you are scared. This lesson becomes especially important because the game eventually tests Peter in a way that forces him to make a difficult choice. Before that happens, however, the group must survive another wave of creatures. Jumanji releases a massive swarm of insects, and the house suddenly becomes impossible to navigate. Giant mosquitoes attack the characters, forcing them to run from room to room. The insects are terrifying because their size makes them capable of causing real damage. Alan uses his knowledge of the jungle to direct everyone towards safer areas, while Sarah tries to protect Judy and Peter. The chaos is also mixed with moments of dark humor because the characters are ordinary people reacting to completely ridiculous circumstances. A board game has effectively turned their home into a supernatural jungle, and they have to improvise with whatever objects are available. This mixture of danger and comedy is one of the reasons the movie remains entertaining even when the stakes are serious. The characters are frightened, but their personalities prevent the story from becoming completely dark. Robin Williams gives Alan an energetic physicality that makes his reactions entertaining, but there is always a sense that Alan's humor is partly a defense mechanism. He has spent so long in danger that he has learned to react to terrifying situations with a strange mixture of disbelief and determination. Sarah's reactions are different. She is more emotionally connected to the past, so every new event reminds her of what happened to Alan. Judy and Peter provide a younger perspective, reacting to the creatures with the natural shock and curiosity of children. As the insects disappear, the group gets another opportunity to reach the board. They return to their positions and prepare for another role. But before they can fully focus on the game, Van Pelt appears again. His presence immediately changes the mood because he represents a completely different kind of danger. The animals released by Jumanji act according to instinct, but Van Pelt is intelligent. He can plan, track, and manipulate the environment. Most importantly, he is focused specifically on Alan. He sees Alan as his prey and is determined to finish the hunt that began inside Jumanji. Alan recognizes that Van Pelt is connected to the worst memories of his years in the jungle. He remembers being hunted, hiding, and constantly fearing that Van Pelt would find him. For 26 years, Alan had to live with the knowledge that something was always looking for him. Now, the hunter has followed him into the real world. Alan tries to stay calm, but the psychological effect is obvious. Sarah sees his fear and realizes how much Alan has suffered. She encourages him not to let Van Pelt control him. This is another turning point for Alan. Throughout his life, he has believed that his disappearance made him weak or disappointing, especially because of his relationship with his father. But now he understands that surviving Jumanji was itself an enormous achievement. He survived because he was strong enough to adapt. Van Pelt may be dangerous, but Alan is no longer the helpless child he once was. He has experience, determination, and people who are willing to stand beside him. Van Pelt attacks, and the group is forced to escape. The chase moves through the house and eventually into the streets of Brantford. The sight of a dangerous hunter pursuing people through an ordinary town creates one of the movie's most memorable contrasts. Cars, houses, shops, and roads become part of a supernatural adventure. People who have no idea about Jumanji witness animals and destruction and react with confusion. The authorities attempt to understand the situation, but there is no ordinary explanation for what is happening. The town's police force becomes involved, but conventional law enforcement is not prepared for a supernatural board game. This creates some of the movie's comedic moments because the officers are trying to treat impossible events as if they were normal criminal incidents. Meanwhile, Alan and the others know that the real solution is still the game. They cannot allow themselves to become distracted by every individual creature or problem. Their goal is to finish the board. Alan tells everyone that they have to return to the mansion and continue playing. But getting back is difficult because the town has become increasingly dangerous. Jumanji has released creatures across Brantford, and the players must avoid them while also staying ahead of Van Pelt. The group eventually manages to return to the house, but the mansion is now even more chaotic than before. Plants have grown through the rooms, animals are moving around, and parts of the building are damaged. Yet, the board remains exactly where they left it, waiting for the next move. The players gather around it again. The message appears, and Judy tries to interpret it. They have learned that the clues are not simply instructions, but warnings about the next challenge. If they can understand the clue correctly, they may have a chance to prepare. If they misunderstand it, they may walk directly into danger. The game rolls onward, and another supernatural event begins. This time, enormous vines and plants spread rapidly throughout the mansion. The vegetation grows with unnatural speed, wrapping around furniture, walls, and even the players. The house begins looking like a jungle temple rather than a home. Alan fights to free himself and help the others, but the plants are incredibly strong. Sarah grabs a nearby object and tries to break the vines, while Judy and Peter work together to escape. The scene demonstrates one of Jumanji's most important characteristics. The environment itself can become an enemy. The characters cannot simply run away from an animal because the floor, walls, and plants can also attack them. Alan uses his knowledge of survival to find a way through the vegetation. He identifies weaker areas and leads the group toward an opening. They escape, but another problem appears. The house is becoming unstable, and the supernatural forces are causing massive structural damage. Alan realizes that they may not have much time left. If they cannot finish the game soon, the mansion could become completely destroyed, and the effects of Jumanji may spread even farther. The players continue. Peter's role becomes more important as the pressure increases. He has been frightened throughout the adventure, but he has also learned from Alan. He begins taking responsibility for protecting Judy. He knows that his sister is counting on him, and that gives him confidence. However, Jumanji tests him in a cruel way. A later turn causes Peter to begin physically transforming. The game is punishing him for attempting to cheat or manipulate the rules. Peter starts developing animal like characteristics, and his fear becomes overwhelming. He realizes that if he cannot complete his turn correctly, he may continue changing. This becomes one of the most emotional moments for the children because Peter is terrified that he may never return to normal. Alan reassures him that they will fix it, but the only solution is to continue the game. Peter's transformation also shows how serious Jumanji's rules are. The game is not something players can manipulate, it demands obedience. Every action has a consequence. Peter must overcome his fear and trust the others. Judy refuses to abandon her brother, and Alan promises that they will finish the game. Sarah supports them as well, and the group becomes even more united. This is one of the moments when Peter truly grows. He realizes that he cannot simply wait for adults to solve the problem. He must participate. He becomes willing to take risks and continue playing even though he knows the game can hurt him. His courage is not dramatic or heroic in the traditional sense. It is the courage of a child who is terrified but refuses to give up. Meanwhile, Van Pelt continues hunting Alan. He is relentless and increasingly close. Alan knows that they cannot spend too much time fighting him because the board must remain their priority. Yet, Van Pelt represents an unfinished part of Alan's past, and eventually Alan must face him. The confrontation between them becomes more personal than any previous encounter. Van Pelt reminds Alan of the jungle and the years he spent hiding. Alan's instinct is initially to run, because running is what kept him alive for decades. But he eventually realizes that he cannot keep running forever. If he wants to truly return to normal life, he must face the thing that terrified him for so long. Alan confronts Van Pelt, and the two engage in a dangerous struggle. Alan is no longer the helpless child Van Pelt remembers. He has survived the jungle and learned how to fight back. The fight is intense, but Alan's goal is not simply to defeat Van Pelt. He wants to prove to himself that the fear no longer controls him. Sarah and the children help create an opportunity for Alan to escape, and eventually Van Pelt is forced back. The group returns to the board. The victory is temporary, but it gives Alan confidence. He has faced his past and survived. The emotional significance of the confrontation is more important than the physical result. Alan is beginning to understand that he can live in the present without constantly being haunted by what happened in the jungle. Sarah sees this change and feels proud of him. Their relationship has become stronger because they have both confronted the past together. The next turns become increasingly dangerous. Jumanji seems to know exactly how to challenge the players. It creates situations that target their fears and weaknesses. For Alan, it brings the jungle and Van Pelt. For Peter, it brings transformation and fear of losing himself. For Sarah, it brings memories of the night Alan disappeared. For Judy, it brings the possibility of losing her brother and the people she has come to trust. The game is therefore not only a physical challenge, it is psychological. Each player must overcome something inside themselves. This makes the adventure more meaningful because the final victory will require more than reaching the last square. They must also change as people. Alan has to stop seeing himself as the boy who failed his father. Sarah has to stop blaming herself for Alan's disappearance. Peter has to overcome his fear. And Judy has to learn that she cannot protect everyone by controlling every situation. The game forces them to confront these issues while simultaneously throwing supernatural dangers at them. The balance between fantasy adventure and emotional storytelling becomes stronger as the movie moves toward its final act. Outside the mansion, the town continues suffering from Jumanji's effects. Wild animals move through the streets, people flee from danger, and authorities struggle to maintain order. The chaos becomes so widespread that Brantford feels like a completely different place. The ordinary world has been replaced by the rules of the game. Alan knows that if they fail, the consequences may become permanent. This creates urgency. They cannot simply wait for the game to stop because Jumanji has no intention of stopping. The board has to reach its final space. The characters continue taking turns. Each successful move brings them closer, but each new challenge creates another obstacle. They begin counting the remaining spaces and realize that the end is finally approaching. For Alan, the realization is emotional because he has waited 26 years for this moment. He remembers being trapped inside the jungle, wondering if anyone would ever find the game again. Now he is finally close to freedom. Sarah feels the same mixture of hope and fear. She has spent years believing that Alan was gone, and now she is watching him prepare to leave the nightmare behind. Judy and Peter have also become emotionally attached to Alan and Sarah. What began as a strange encounter has become a family like bond. The four have survived together, and they know that their lives will be changed by what they have experienced. But the final stages of the game are not easy. Jumanji saves some of its most dangerous challenges for the end. The characters have to move through a house that is almost completely overtaken by the jungle. Animals are everywhere, plants cover the walls, and the sound of the drums becomes almost constant. Van Pelt remains a threat, waiting for another opportunity to capture Alan. The players must continue despite exhaustion. Alan reminds them that every completed turn brings them closer to the end. Peter's transformation begins to become more serious, and the group understands that time is running out. Judy stays beside him, refusing to let fear separate them. Sarah and Alan continue working together to interpret the clues. Their cooperation shows how much they have changed since 1969. They are no longer frightened children who do not understand what they have started. They are adults taking responsibility for their actions. The next clue appears, and this time the meaning seems to point towards something massive and destructive. Alan looks at the board and understands that the game is preparing one of its most dangerous challenges yet. The drums grow louder and everyone prepares themselves. Suddenly, the floor shakes. Something enormous is approaching. The players look toward the entrance and realize that the next threat may be larger than anything they have seen so far. The atmosphere becomes tense because they know they are very close to the end. But Jumanji is not going to let them reach it easily. A huge herd of animals suddenly appears, creating a stampede that tears through the streets and destroys anything in its path. Elephants, rhinoceroses, zebras, and other creatures rush through Brantford as if the town has been transformed into an African savanna. The sight is spectacular and terrifying at the same time. The characters struggle to stay alive as the animals move around them. Buildings shake, vehicles are pushed aside, and people run for safety. Alan understands that this is not simply another animal attack. It is Jumanji demonstrating its full power. The game can create an entire ecosystem in the middle of a modern town. The players must find a way through the chaos and return to the board. The stampede also demonstrates how the movie constantly increases the scale of its dangers. What began with small creatures has now become an entire wave of massive animals. The characters can no longer rely on hiding inside a room. They must move quickly and intelligently. Alan guides the group through the chaos, using his survival instincts to predict how the animals will move. Sarah protects the children, while Judy keeps Peter moving. Eventually, they make it back toward the mansion. The building is damaged, but the board is still there. The group gathers around it again, exhausted but determined. They realize that only a few moves remain. This gives them hope, but it also increases the tension because failure now seems more painful than ever. They have come too far to lose. Alan looks at Sarah and remembers the night they first played. He realizes how different everything is now. They were children then, frightened by a game they did not understand. Now they are adults who have returned to finish it. Sarah tells Alan that they can do this together. Their shared history gives the moment emotional weight. Alan prepares to roll again. The dice hit the board and everyone waits for the next clue. The supernatural message appears, and this time the players immediately understand that the final challenges are approaching. Van Pelt enters again, and the group realizes that Alan will have to confront him one last time. The hunter aims his weapon and tells Alan that the hunt is almost over. Alan stands his ground. He has spent 26 years running from this man, but now he refuses to run. The confrontation becomes a symbolic battle between Alan's past and present. Van Pelt represents everything Alan feared about Jumanji, while Alan represents the person he has become after surviving it. With Sarah, Judy, and Peter supporting him, Alan finally defeats the hunter's attempt to control him. Van Pelt is forced back into the game and the immediate threat disappears. Alan has finally overcome the figure who haunted his memories for decades. He does not celebrate because he knows the game is still unfinished. But there is a noticeable change in his confidence. He is no longer afraid in the same way. He knows that the worst thing Jumanji could do has already happened to him and he survived. Now he only has to finish. The players return to the board for the final stretch. Peter is still affected by the game's punishment, but the group refuses to leave him behind. Judy holds his hand, and Alan promises that once the game ends, everything will be restored. Sarah reminds them that they have to trust the game and follow its rules. They take another turn. The message appears, and the board reveals that they are almost at the final space. The excitement is mixed with fear because everyone understands that the last move will determine whether the game finally releases them. Alan thinks about his brother. No. Alan's thoughts return to his parents and the life he lost. He remembers his father's voice, his childhood bedroom, the factory, and the ordinary moments he once considered unimportant. Now those memories are precious. Sarah also reflects on her own life and realizes that the fear she carried for 26 years no longer has the same power. Judy and Peter think about their parents and the strange journey that brought them to the parish mansion. All four players understand that whatever happens next, they will never forget this experience. The drums become louder. The final stage is approaching. But Jumanji still has one last surprise waiting, and the players are about to discover that reaching the end of the board will require the most important thing they have learned throughout the entire adventure. They must trust one another. Alan picks up the dice, looks at the board, and prepares to make the next move. The game has already taken 26 years from his life, but now the finish line is finally visible. Sarah stands beside him. Judy and Peter are ready. The supernatural jungle surrounds them. The town outside is still in chaos, and the sound of the drums fills the air. The next roll will bring them closer to freedom than ever before, but it will also trigger the final chain of events that will determine whether Jumanji finally ends or continues its terrifying game. The game is now approaching its most dangerous stage, and Alan Parrish, Sarah Whittle, Judy Shepard, and Peter Shepard have reached a point where there is no possibility of turning back. Because after everything they have survived, the final spaces on the Jumanji board are finally within reach. But the closer they get to completing the game, the more violent and unpredictable the supernatural world becomes. And Alan knows that Jumanji has saved some of its most dangerous challenges for the end. The four players have already witnessed giant insects, wild monkeys, massive plants, dangerous animals, supernatural transformations, and the terrifying hunter Van Pelt. But none of those experiences has prepared them for the scale of what is coming next. Outside the parish mansion, Brantford has almost completely lost its normal appearance. The quiet town that Alan remembers from 1969 has become a place filled with animals and destruction, and ordinary people are running through streets that now look more like a jungle than a modern American town. Cars have been abandoned, buildings have been damaged, and the police are struggling to understand what is happening. Nobody can explain where the animals came from, and nobody outside the four players understands that the entire disaster is connected to a board game sitting inside the parish house. Alan looks at the destruction around him and realizes that the game has become bigger than his personal nightmare. When he first discovered Jumanji as a child, he could never have imagined that his decision to play would eventually threaten an entire town. Now he feels responsible for everything happening around them. Sarah understands his feelings because she remembers being there on that original night. She knows that Alan never intended to cause any of this. He was simply a curious child who found something mysterious and wanted to play. But Jumanji does not care about intentions. It follows its own rules, and once the game begins, the players have to accept the consequences. This is one of the most important lessons Alan has learned during his years inside the supernatural jungle. He cannot change what happened in 1969, but he can decide what he does now. He can finish the game. He can protect Judy and Peter. He can help Sarah finally escape the guilt that has followed her for 26 years. And he can finally put the nightmare behind him. The four return to the board and prepare for another move. The room is barely recognizable. Jungle plants have taken over the walls, pieces of furniture have been destroyed, and strange noises can be heard everywhere. The drums of Jumanji continue beating in the distance, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm that reminds everyone that the game is still active. Judy studies the board carefully, trying to understand how many spaces remain. Peter stands beside her, still dealing with the effects of the game's earlier punishment. He has been transformed because he attempted to cheat, and the transformation has made him terrified that he may never become himself again. But Alan keeps telling him that the only way to reverse what happened is to finish the game. Peter begins to believe him. The boy who was once frightened by every new danger is slowly becoming one of the strongest members of the group. He has learned that running away does not solve the problem. The only way forward is to face it. Sarah sees this transformation and recognizes how much the children have changed since discovering the game. They are still children, but the experience has forced them to grow quickly. Judy has become more confident and protective of her brother, while Peter has learnt that courage can exist even when fear is overwhelming. Alan feels a strange sense of responsibility toward them because he knows exactly what it is like to lose your childhood because of Jumanji. He refuses to allow the game to take theirs as well. The next clue appears on the board, and the players read it carefully. The message gives them a warning about what is coming. They have learned that Jumanji communicates through riddles, and every riddle contains information about the next challenge. They do not always understand the clues immediately, but now they are becoming better at interpreting them. Alan recognizes certain patterns from his years inside the game, while Judy is able to analyze the wording quickly. Sarah contributes her memory of the original game, and Peter listens carefully. Their teamwork is now one of their greatest strengths. The dice are rolled, and for a moment, everything becomes quiet. Then the sound of thunderous movement begins outside. The ground shakes, the walls tremble. Alan looks toward the windows and immediately realizes that something enormous is approaching. The next Jumanji challenge is not a single animal, it is a massive stampede. Huge herds of animals suddenly rush through Brantford, turning the streets into a river of movement and destruction. Elephants, rhinoceroses, zebras, and other creatures charge through the town, smashing obstacles and sending people running for safety. The sequence demonstrates the enormous scale of Jumanji's power. The game can transform an entire town into a supernatural wilderness. Alan and the others have to find a way through the chaos without being trampled. They move carefully, watching the direction of the animals and using whatever shelter they can find. The scene is terrifying because the animals are not evil. They are simply behaving according to the rules of the game, which means the characters cannot reason with them. They have to survive the stampede. Alan's survival skills become essential. His years inside Jumanji taught him how to read animal movement and recognize danger. He directs the others towards safer areas, telling them when to move and when to stay still. Sarah follows his instructions while protecting Judy and Peter. The four eventually manage to escape the worst of the stampede and make their way back toward the mansion. When they arrive, the house looks even more destroyed than before, but the board is still waiting for them. This becomes a recurring image throughout the movie. Everything around the game can be destroyed, but the game itself remains untouched. It almost feels indestructible, as if the supernatural force inside it exists outside normal physical laws. Alan understands that destroying the board is not the answer. The only way to end Jumanji is to complete it. The players take their positions again. They are exhausted, but the knowledge that only a few spaces remain gives them renewed determination. Alan looks at Sarah, and for a moment they remember the two children they once were. In 1969, they were simply friends who found a strange game. Neither understood the danger. Alan had been struggling with his relationship with his father, and Sarah had been trying to support him. Then the game changed everything. Alan disappeared, and Sarah's life was permanently altered. Now, 26 years later, they are standing together again, older and wiser, with a chance to finish the story. Sarah tells Alan that they are going to make it. Alan smiles because for the first time since returning, he truly believes it. But before they can make the next move, another threat appears. Van Pelt returns. The hunter has been following Alan throughout the adventure, and he is determined to complete his mission. For Alan, Van Pelt is more than a dangerous enemy. He represents everything that Alan feared during his years inside Jumanji. Van Pelt was the hunter who chased him through the jungle, forcing him to hide and survive. Alan has spent 26 years trying to escape that fear. Now, Van Pelt is standing in front of him again. The hunter points his weapon at Alan and makes it clear that the chase is not over. Alan initially reacts with the same instinct he developed inside the game: run, hide, survive. But then he stops. He realizes that he has spent enough of his life running from this figure. He is no longer the frightened child who entered Jumanji. He is an adult who has survived the impossible. He has friends beside him. He has a reason to fight. He has a future waiting for him. Alan decides to confront Van Pelt directly. The confrontation is intense because it is both physical and psychological. Van Pelt believes Alan is still his prey, but Alan refuses to accept that role. He uses everything he learned from the jungle to defend himself. Sarah and the children help him when they can, but Alan eventually realizes that he must face Van Pelt himself. The hunter represents Alan's past, and only Alan can finally overcome it. Their battle moves through the mansion, with furniture and plants becoming part of the struggle. Van Pelt is strong and experienced, but Alan is determined. Eventually, Alan finds a way to defeat him and force him back into the supernatural world from which he came. The victory is important not because Van Pelt was the biggest physical threat, but because Alan has finally overcome one of the deepest fears of his life. He no longer sees himself as the helpless boy who was hunted through the jungle. He now understands that surviving the past has made him stronger. Sarah sees the change in him immediately. She realizes that Alan is finally free emotionally, even though the game is not yet finished physically. Alan returns to the board and the group prepares for the next turn. Peter's condition is becoming more serious and Judy is increasingly worried about him. She refuses to leave his side. Alan promises them that everything will be restored if they complete the game. Peter trusts him. This trust is important because Alan himself has spent much of his life struggling to trust the future. He has lived in survival mode for so long that imagining a normal life feels almost impossible. But watching Judy and Peter believe in him gives Alan confidence. He realizes that he can still be useful. He may have lost 26 years, but he can use what remains to help others. The game continues. Another role brings another challenge, and this time the mansion becomes filled with a powerful supernatural force. The characters are thrown into chaos as the environment shifts around them. Plants grow, animals move through rooms, and objects are destroyed. The group struggles to stay together. Judy grabs Peter's hand, Sarah stays close to Alan, and Alan continues watching the board. The game is trying to separate them, but they refuse to allow that to happen. Their unity becomes their defense. They have learned that Jumanji becomes more dangerous when they panic and separate. If they stay together, they can respond to each challenge more effectively. The next clue appears, and the characters realize that the game is nearing its conclusion. They count the remaining spaces and understand that only a few turns remain. For Alan, the realization is overwhelming. He has waited 26 years for this moment. He remembers the jungle, the loneliness, the constant danger, and the hope that someday someone would play Jumanji again. Now that day has arrived, and the end is finally visible. Sarah feels emotional because she knows that once the game is finished, the strange connection between them and Jumanji will finally be broken. Judy and Peter are excited to return to normal life, but they are also afraid because they know that the final turns could be the most dangerous. Alan tells them that they have already survived the worst. But even as he says it, he knows that Jumanji has a way of surprising its players. The final stretch becomes a race against time. The supernatural events are spreading farther through Brantford, and the longer the game continues, the more damage is being caused. The police and townspeople are trying to survive the chaos, but nobody understands how to stop it. Alan knows that only the players can solve the problem. He feels the weight of responsibility more strongly than ever. He is the person who started the game, even if he never intended to do so. Finishing it is his responsibility. Sarah reminds him that he was only a child. He could not have known what would happen. This is important because Alan has spent years blaming himself. He has believed that his disappearance caused pain for his family and Sarah. But Sarah tells him that they were children, and children cannot be expected to understand supernatural forces. Alan finally begins to forgive himself. He realizes that he does not need to spend the rest of his life punishing himself for a mistake he made as a boy. The game has already taken enough from him. He is determined not to let it take his future as well. The group makes another move. Peter's transformation becomes more intense,
and he becomes increasingly frightened. Judy encourages him, telling him that he is still her brother no matter what happens. Alan tells Peter to keep fighting. Sarah reminds him that they are almost finished. Peter gathers his courage and continues. This moment shows how far he has come. At the beginning of the story, Peter was nervous and unsure. Now he is willing to face the game even when it is changing him. He has learned that bravery is not about being fearless, it is about refusing to give up when you are afraid. The next roll moves them closer to the final space. Another supernatural event begins, but this time the players are ready. They move together, protecting one another and following the clues. Alan's experience, Sarah's determination, Judy's intelligence, and Peter's courage combine into a single strategy. They have become a team. The game cannot easily defeat them because they are no longer four frightened individuals. They are four people who trust one another. The final stages of Jumanji also begin revealing the emotional meaning behind the adventure. Alan's journey was about returning home after losing his childhood. Sarah's journey was about facing the guilt and fear that followed Alan's disappearance. Judy and Peter's journey was about surviving a crisis while dealing with the loss of their parents and adjusting to a new life with their aunt. Each character has experienced some form of loss. Jumanji brings them together because each needs something the others can provide. Alan gives the children courage and knowledge. The children give Alan a reason to care about the future. Sarah gives Alan emotional support and reminds him of who he was before Jumanji. Alan gives Sarah the opportunity to finally confront her past. Their stories become connected through the game. As another turn begins, the characters hear the familiar drums. This sound has become almost like the heartbeat of Jumanji. Every time it plays, everyone knows another challenge is approaching. But now, the drums sound different to Alan. Earlier, they represented fear. Now, they represent the possibility of freedom. He knows that each beat brings them closer to the end. The board reveals another clue. Judy reads it, and the group realizes that the final move is close. They prepare themselves. Outside, the chaos continues, but inside the mansion, everything becomes strangely focused. The players are no longer distracted by the destruction around them. They have one objective: finish the game. Alan takes the dice. His hands are steady. Sarah stands beside him. Judy and Peter watch closely. He throws the dice and everyone waits. The piece moves forward. The game responds. Another supernatural challenge begins, but this time the characters know that they are almost there. They survive the challenge and return to the board. One final stage remains. Alan looks at the board and realizes that he has reached the point where he disappeared as a child. The emotional significance is enormous. He is literally finishing the same game that took him away decades ago. The circle is almost complete. Sarah remembers the night they began, and she realizes that they are now standing at the place where everything started. Alan tells her that they are going to finish it together. The final roll is not simply another move, it represents the end of 26 years of fear, guilt, loneliness, and uncertainty. Judy and Peter are ready. Sarah is ready. Alan takes a breath. But before he can roll, the game produces one final major obstacle. and the players realize that Jumanji will not release them without one last test. The mansion shakes violently, the jungle grows around them, and the drums become louder than ever. The characters hold on to one another as the supernatural force reaches its peak. Alan looks at Sarah and tells her that no matter what happens, they cannot give up. Sarah nods. Judy protects Peter. Peter gathers the courage he has learned throughout the adventure. The four stand together as the final challenge approaches. For the first time, Alan does not feel like a prisoner of Jumanji. He feels like someone who is choosing to finish it. That difference is everything. 26 years ago, the game controlled Alan's life. Now Alan is taking control of the game. He rolls the dice again, and the piece moves closer to the final destination. The board seems to come alive. The jungle roars around them, and the supernatural energy reaches its highest point. The characters know they are seconds away from discovering whether they have truly won. Alan looks at the final space and realizes that he has finally reached the end of the road that began when he was a frightened child in 1969. The game has taken his childhood, but it cannot take the rest of his life. Sarah has spent 26 years carrying guilt, but she is finally ready to let